Now available in paperback and e-readers, Spinsterella Goth Girl Summer. Take a trip into the macabre world of goth modeling in the new millennium in this spooktacular Spinsterella story. Pick up your copy of Spinsterella Goth Girl Summer in paperback and e-readers at Amazon.com and online booksellers everywhere. Better get the coleslaw, y'all, cause we're having us a barbecue. America's math just ain't mathing. And that's the core to America's cost of living crisis. The main reason I believe we have a cost of living crisis here in America is because many of the wealthy in this country and abroad basically are completely disconnected from the average everyday working man and woman here in America. And because they're disconnected from the average everyday working man and woman here in America, because they have billions of dollars, they don't see how the little salaries they're paying just don't work out for the average everyday American. Now, the math, as I see it, hasn't mathed for at least a good decade to 15 years because the average everyday American's wages have not gone up in any way, shape, or form in the last 15 years. And even worse, when it comes down to many Americans who are working, they're finding that many of the jobs they used to have don't really last as long as they did during the time of the baby boomers. No, in the time of the baby boomers, a person could basically get one job with a high school diploma and have that job at a factory or even at an office or a city job for over 40 years and retire on that job. And that would enable that person to be able to build a savings and go out here and have enough money to not only be able to take care of themselves, but allow them to go out here and invest in things like being able to buy a home or go out here and be able to buy a car or a series of cars. And that stability allowed many Americans to again live middle class lifestyles for a good 20 years here in America until the 1990 recession that was instigated by then President George H.W. Bush. And that's where the state of the quality of life in America started to go into a state of decline. Now, in that 1989-1990 recession, what happened is that many companies started looking to go more overseas to do their manufacturing. And as they decided to do manufacturing, this led to a lot of Americans losing those good, stable jobs that many of the baby boomers and many of the silent generation had. And that led to fiscal instability where the math started to not really add up. And as the math started to not add up, what happened was that we had that 1991 recession, which really changed America's economy. And then we had the Clinton administration come in and look to further change the economy by taking us away from manufacturing all the way to a service economy, where we went from people making $30,000 to $40,000 a year as a base and going up to making six figures at working at factory jobs if they stayed there for 15 to 20 years, to service jobs that basically started out at the time with wages from $4.25 to $7 an hour and maxed out maybe at about $10 to $15 an hour. And that was a very dramatic drop as related to wages here in this country as we left manufacturing and went into a service economy. And instead of people being able to build middle class lifestyles like they did from the 1920s to the 1980s, what happened is a lot of people basically saw their lives destabilized, and as they saw their lives destabilized, they saw that many of these jobs again, in addition to paying way less as related to the service economy, basically were not really stable like those old factory jobs and old office jobs and city jobs where you could basically, again, go and see 40 years of your life pass by. You could see 40 years of your life pass by in a city job or a service or manufacturing job in the middle of the 20th century. But by the time we got to the 1990s, when we had the 89-91 recession, what happened was those jobs basically went from jobs you had for 40 years to jobs that you had from a maximum period to 5 to 10 years, and Americans started hopping from job to job. Basically, again, they could build a bit of a savings before they had to go to their next job, but there was no stable income. And yes, there were Americans who could buy houses because homes at that time basically were still about $100,000. And again, if you still had one of these jobs for 5 or 10 years, you could basically afford to still be able to buy a home or even buy a car because car manufacturers like GM, Ford, and Chrysler, and even import companies were making entry-level cars. They were making entry-level cars like the Ford Escort. They were still making entry-level cars like the Dodge Neon and the Geo Prism, cars that cost under $10,000 or $12,000 to $15,000, and people in the South could go out here and buy an S10 truck for $12,000 to $15,000. And if you were in the middle class, you could buy an Accord or a Camry for $20,000. So people could afford things because they were making decent money. And if you had a college degree, you could go out here and upon maybe $35,000, and you could afford to buy a home and get a mortgage. You could afford to buy a car. But things started to change in the mid-90s as related to America's economy as we transitioned into service. As we transitioned into service again, the jobs themselves stopped being as stable as they were before when we had manufacturing. And what happened was as the jobs stopped being stable, again, people's money started to struggle. They started to have a few little struggles here and there. But the whole thing is that what happened was you had a lot of employers you couldn't come in on entry-level jobs like they did before. This is where I had struggles because even with a college degree, you had employers insisting on bachelor's degrees, insisting on master's degrees for entry-level jobs, and that led to a lot of Americans not being able to come into the job market. Again, a lot of the boomers, as they became managers, insisted on multiple degrees for entry-level jobs. And again, this is where we started to see issues as related to, again, the cost of living crisis because people started to go to school, and as they went to school, they started racking up these student loans, and in order to get those entry-level jobs, they started racking up debts, and on top of that, a lot of these kids were being offered credit cards. I remember in the 1980s, it was hard to get a credit card. You had to have, again, stable credit. You had to be at a job for 10 years in order to get a credit card back in the 80s. And by the time we got to the late 80s, you didn't need to have a job. And by the time we got to the 90s, you didn't even need to have anything. And we offered credit to just about any college kid as they were getting these student loans. And that's where the math started to stop mathing. It stopped mathing because, again, you had kids going to college. And again, as they came out, they had $100,000 to $200,000 in debt. And they had student loans. And on top of the student loans, the jobs were not paying as much. I mean, they were only paying $20,000 to $30,000 a year at entry level at the time of the 1990s. We did have a boom in the late 90s with the internet, again, creating an internet boom where salaries did go up a bit. But after the 2001 crash, that's where the math really stopped mathing. It really stopped mathing for most Americans. It stopped mathing because that's where we started to see the entire economy really start to fall apart, especially after 9/11. We started to see the math not mathing because we basically had this service based economy, a service based economy that was being built more and more on debt, more and more on debt of student loans, more and more on debt as related to real estate and speculation from the subprime mortgages, and all of it basically collapsed in 2008. All of it completely collapsed at the time of George W. Bush, and we've been, again, the math hasn't been adding up, and even worse, America's infrastructure basically hasn't been, again, creating an economy that basically allows entry level individuals to enter into the economy. That's what happened after the Great Recession. The economy basically further contracted and again did not open that door for entry level individuals to come in. Again, we still had employers demanding bachelor's degrees and even master's degrees for entry level jobs. And as they demanded this higher education, making the argument, oh, people will be more committed as they stay on these jobs, what had happened is that people with these degrees really didn't last that long. And in some cases, what they would do is quit, constantly hopping from job to job. And even worse, many of the companies themselves were not as stable as the previous companies were. What was happening was many companies were not as stable as they used to be due to a lot of mergers and consolidation, like what was happened with media with the Telecom Act of 1996 and the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which basically led to a lot of these private equity firms buying up a lot of things like property in this country. A lot of the private equity firms were buying up property and they were buying companies and tearing them apart. So businesses weren't being built here in America, and we were only creating a lot of service-based businesses. There wasn't much manufacturing going on. So America was in the middle of a fiscal crisis in the 2010s, and again, that crisis got even worse, where again, you had people, they were still being paid, again, anywhere from $20,000 to maybe $40,000 a year. That's most of what people were making. But as the country was going on through the 2010s, we had, again, private equity firms buying up homes to drive up their value artificially, and we had many car manufacturers going out here and not making the entry-level cars that they used to make. I mean, Chevrolet no longer makes the S10 Blazer or the S10 truck that again only costs $12,000. They don't make again the Mazda 3s or the Dodge Neons or the Ford Focuses. Again, the car industry has suffered a lot because there are no entry-level cars for the first-time buyer who's again in their 20s, who basically wants to buy their first new car. No, these days, most car manufacturers make cars that start, again, with the Toyota Camrys and the Honda Accords. Again, cars that guys get when they start to enter the middle class. And on top of that, they make a lot of SUVs with a lot of technology in them that cost $40,000 to $50,000. So there's no way for a young person to enter into the economy, and that's the main reason why the math ain't mathing. Private equity drove up the price of homes from, again, $200,000 to $100,000 to $500,000 and $1 million. And then you have the, again, auto manufacturers manufacturing cars that basically, without an entry-level car like a Dodge, again, I'll repeat it once more, a Dodge Neon, a Ford Focus, or Pontiac Grand Am, or Chevrolet Cavalier. Again, these were the entry points for young people, but the young people can't afford to come in, and that's what's creating the affordability crisis, because many of the wealthy in this country don't understand the reality of the average everyday American. Again, when you get your degree, you're already in debt, and again, you're trying to pay down that debt, but it's hard to pay down debt when you can't get an entry-level job, or if you do get an entry-level job, you're not going to stay in that job no longer than a year, because what's happening to many millennials is what's happened to many Gen Xers like myself. Yeah, we'll get a job if we do have, and we have to fight for that job, and what happens usually is those jobs don't last long. In the 90s, they barely lasted 5 years, but for many millennials and Gen Z, yeah, they can get a job, but the job only lasts maybe a year. Some of them only last 9 months. And again, you can't start your life if your job is basically ending every 9 months to a year. How can you build the savings in order to be able to, again, even get things like a mortgage? Because in order to get a mortgage, you have to go out here and work, again, 10, 15 years to get a mortgage. And on top of that, in order to get financing for a car, you need to have credit, again, for 10 or 15 years, or even 5 years at the minimum. Again, how can you build your credit if your job doesn't last long? And that's where the disconnect with the wealthy basically is, as related to things that's creating this whole fiscal crisis, as related to the cost of living crisis. The entire cost of living crisis, again, the math ain't mathing. Again, a person making $20,000 to $40,000 a year can't enter into the economy when your cars cost $50,000 as related to an because there's no entry level cars, and you're talking about $500,000 to $1 million for a home, because private equity and these hedge funds have speculated the market for real estate to the point where new owners can't come in. And as they go out here hoarding property, they're basically creating a time bomb, because many of those homes have issues like property tax and maintenance that eventually are going to overwhelm private equity, like they did with landlords here in New York in the 1970s and the 1980s. Many of those landlords thought they could hold on to property and hoard it for years, but eventually what happened was the property tax became too high, because the assessed value was, again, made to be more than the value of the property, and eventually the property tax became more than the value of the property, and people were forced to abandon the property because the property tax and the maintenance costs wound up eating them up. And when it came down to a lot of these homes that private equity currently is hoarding, where they're buying neighborhoods, eventually we're going to see a maintenance apocalypse, because again, if you've got homes and they're just sitting there, the pipes aren't being used, the heating isn't being used, and again, that's going to create a catastrophe when people start using those things, just like car owners who own classic cars. If they don't drive that car, what happens is that the hoses start to deteriorate because rubber deteriorates. Again, the fluids start to coagulate because they start to get old, like the oil and the transmission fluid. Again, cars have to be maintained. And in the case of really expensive cars, you have, like Ferraris and Lamborghinis, you have to do services that sometimes cost $30,000, $40,000. Again, the maintenance on property that private equity is hoarding basically is going to lead to them taking a big loss, and again, a lot of people are being kept out of the economy because these speculators have come in. These wealthy speculators, again, they're like gamblers. Their eyes are glazed over. All they're thinking about is how they're going to make millions and even billions. I mean, it really reminds me a lot of what happened with comic books when the speculators came in and then we had a big crash. But what's happening to the average everyday American is that the math isn't mathing, and the math isn't mathing because, again, you make $20,000 to $45,000, and again, how can you afford to live when apartments are anywhere from $1,500 to $5,000 a month in rent? How can you afford to be able to pay for that rent and your groceries and basically be able to drive back and forth to work when your wages are basically stagnated to the point that they were in the 90s and the 2000s, and the spending power of that money is more limited than it was in the 90s and the 2000s because you don't have the stability of a person who was living in the 1950s or the 1960s or even the 1970s. You don't have that fiscal stability because you can't count on that job being there for at least 10, 15 years. No, the most you can count on a job is basically a year to 9 months. And again, these jobs don't last long. And since they don't last long, you can't really build a life. And this is why many kids are living with their parents and not able to get their own apartment the way they did, like when my brother was around in the 1980s. Back then, you could get a job and basically, again, make $300 a week and basically get yourself an apartment for $300 a month and then have $900 where after your expenses you possibly could save $6, and you could live very well in the 1980s. Yeah, your apartment wouldn't be that fancy, but you could go out here and build the savings towards a home. You could work a job with just a high school diploma and build a life for yourself, but you can't do that today. No, you're already starting out with maybe $100,000 to $200,000 in debt from a college degree with student loans, and then on top of that, you basically can't get that job full time that will allow you to pay again down on the student loans because your jobs are not lasting as long. Your jobs are not lasting that long because, again, when I was working for AmeriCorps Vista, I can tell you from experience, basically 6 months you're just getting your footing, and you need at least 2-3 years to really get yourself stable. I mean, your people's money basically, again, when you're working for the first 6 months, you're just starting to, again, get your bearings as related to things, as related to the world of work. And again, with a year, you're just getting, again, some momentum. And again, with today's job market, you have these billionaires sitting here. Again, they're going out here not keeping people on the job for long. And what's happening is that people these days, again, have to hop from job to job and hope and sometimes go through periods of long-term unemployment between jobs, creating gaps in the resume. But boomers don't understand those gaps. I've run into that myself. Many of the boomers don't understand, hey, the reason why this person has a gap in their resume of 6 months, maybe a year, and even 2-3 years is because they're searching for a job. They're searching for a job to replace the job that they had that only lasted 6 months or a year, and it takes a long time to get another job because today's job market with the boomers, basically, it's who you know and not what you know. I mean, back in the days of the 80s and back in the days of the 70s, again, or even the 50s, a guy said he wanted to work, and the next day he was basically put on the shift and was told again he could get a job. Again, it was just that easy back then. But these days, again, you gotta have a degree, a cajillion references, and basically people, again, letting you in. And again, that's why the math ain't mathing, because many young people, again, basically can't come into the job market, and when they do come in, the job don't last long, and it don't pay that much. I mean, you can't expect a kid who basically, again, makes $20,000 to have the money to buy a $50,000 car or $1 million house. You can't expect a middle class person who makes $50,000 a year to have the money to buy a $50,000 car or $1 million home. No, people don't have money like that. And what exacerbates things is that these hedge funds and these private equity firms, again, even if people do manage to save that money after, again, hopping from job to job, basically they can't use a mortgage to buy a home because everything is cash, because the private equity, they want everything cash for a home. And many of the auto dealers, again, they basically inflate the cost of things. And again, that inflation further goes on into this economy. And again, 2 plus 2 is equaling 5, because the wealthy, again, are living in a bubble, living in their own world, not living in the real world with the rest of us. Many of these billionaires, many of these millionaires, and their underlings in private equity and corporate America are living in their own world, similar to the way that the aristocrats in France in 1789 were living in their own world. Before the French Revolution, you had Marie Antoinette saying, hey, let them eat cake, because all they had was cake. They were disconnected from the people. And again, this is what led to the election of the Orange Man, but who sadly many people thought would make America great again. But sadly, they went to a billionaire to go get help. But the thing is that most Americans just don't see how we have two Americas where the math ain't mathing. No, when you look at the math, it doesn't add up logically. No, America's math just isn't mathing, even for rich people like Taraji P. Henson, who basically looked at her business as related to the numbers, where her agent gets 10%, the IRS gets 50%, her expenses are a certain cost, and she's basically struggling. Again, America's math hasn't mathed in many years, and it hasn't mathed because we haven't taken a critical look at our economy. We haven't taken a critical look at our economy and looked at how unstable it has become. It's become unstable from generation to generation, and as it's become unstable, again, we've gone from Americans working at factories for 40 years to Americans barely working at a job for a year if they can get it. And if you do get those jobs, like those city jobs or those state jobs, or these jobs out here that are a little stable, you've got people in the boomer generation who want to close the door on you and keep you from being able to, again, stay on the job. As related to succession, a lot of these boomers basically want to stay on the job forever in their old age, and as they want to stay on the job, the next generation and the next man can't come in, and those next men and women basically want to get their chance, but they can't get their chance because the boomers still want to stay on. And again, the boomers basically, again, they were the ones who sold out America to many foreign countries, which are now struggling themselves, like you have in Japan, where they've had this L-shaped recession for at least 30 years, and had this L-shaped recession over in Japan, where they're struggling right now because, again, they live in the reality of, again, being afraid of risk because of failures. And the same thing is happening here in America. People are becoming averse to risk, like industries like Hollywood, which are risk-based. And what's happening again is the math ain't mathing. And the cost of living, basically, nobody understands how it adds up. And again, what we're seeing in this country is the math not mathing, because the average everyday person doesn't understand, again, how to do math. as related to, again, economies, and even worse, the rich people in this country and those who do private equity, again, they've got the mindset of an addict where, again, you're not thinking critically about how your speculation is basically choking the lives out of the average everyday American. Many of these guys they're so caught up and addicted in thinking about getting higher value the same way comic book speculators did. I remember in the 90s, early 90s, many comic book speculators basically were driving up value, and then on top of it, they were making a lot of gimmick books, which basically they thought were going to go out here and be worth so much money, but wound up in the dollar bins by the mid 90s because, again, what made those comics valuable was the scarcity of those books. That's what the speculators didn't understand. They thought you could print 1 million copies of an X-Men #1 or Spider-Man #1 or one of these Image books, and it would be worth more money. But no, what made comics valuable was, again, the scarcity of them. And when you have, again, scarcity and demand, that's what drives up value. But what these days, again, you have these guys out here hoarding houses, hoarding cars, again, like those speculators. And the only thing that can happen is that those markets are going to crash because, again, the math ain't mathing. The math ain't mathing because, again, what makes things valuable is scarcity, and scarcity in comparison to demand, that's what makes things, again, valuable. But when you have a glut of a product like homes and cars, and again, people can't come in on an entry level, what's going to happen is your economy will collapse. And again, America's economy, the math ain't mathing, and sadly, many who are in charge at the top don't want to deal with this reality. No, they're still caught up in the fantasy of their gambling addictions, caught up in the fantasy of it's going to be worth so much, when sadly, what they're doing is destroying the value of everything, because the young people can't come in. The young people can't come into pop culture. The young people can't come into, again, buying their own property. And because they can't invest in America, what's happening is the young people are tuning out because they can't get their chance. They can't get their opportunity. They can't get their break. And again, this is the thing that will eventually wind up breaking America, because the boomers won't let go, and won't let the young people come in, won't let them get their Ford Focus or their Ford Escort or their Chevrolet Chevette, won't let them get their first apartment because you're hoarding apartments for high value tenants, won't let the small business person start their small business because they're basically hoarding many of the stores and keeping them for these franchises and high value clients. And again, that's keeping America from being able to grow and be able to grow the economy. You can't grow the economy on old businesses. You have to build new ones. And sadly, America is undermining itself because you have a bunch of rich old people who want to think that they can live forever and don't want to pass on anything as related to succession, don't want to pass on anything as related to legacy, and don't want to open the door for the next man to come in, not understanding that in order for you to have your legacy, the next generation has to care. And again, if they don't care, it's like in Japan, nobody young wants anything because the old people haven't given them a reason to care. And again, if you don't give people a reason to care, then everything you built will basically fall apart because the next generation won't care about it. That's what's happening right now with pop culture, with Star Wars, with many of these even this Marvel Cinematic Universe. Nobody cares anymore because new people can't come in, new culture can't come in, and new culture can't come in because we have a bottleneck from boomers basically looking to keep their culture, keep their way of life, and as they choke out life, again, you have this whole cost of living crisis where new people can't afford to come in, and because the new people can't come in, the country is dying, because when it comes down to our economy, the critical question nobody has asked: what happens when the parents wind up dying and the kids can't keep up? I mean, nobody understands that question. Kids live with their parents, but if they wind up dying, there's nobody to pay the property tax, there's nobody to pay the insurance, nobody to pay the maintenance costs, because you didn't invest in the next generation, you didn't invest in the heirs, you never gave them a reason to care, you never brought them in and gave them stability. No, you didn't do that for Gen X, you didn't do that for millennials, you didn't do that for Gen Z, and that's where America will again go into a worse state of decline, because we didn't understand, like I said in the previous video, the importance of developing successors, the importance of developing heirs, the importance of legacy. No, when it came down to the boomer generation, they had it good, and they didn't think about the next man coming after them, and that's why we have a cost of living crisis similar to the one that almost wiped America out in the 1970s. Now, if you want to help me out as related to my business, you can pick up some of my books on the SJS Direct imprint on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find those books at other online booksellers like Drafted Digital, Google Play, Barnes & Noble, and big box retailers like Walmart and Target. And if you'd like to help me on this channel continue to stay on the air and be able to pay my bills, you can drop a donation to the Patreon, the PayPal, or the Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers, John Haynes, A Thorn in My Side. The man who rules the world takes on an agent from the CIA from the Black Way in this all-new John Haynes series adventure. Get your copy of John Haynes' A Thorn in My Side in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere. Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis, Dark Incubus. The goddess next door gets enthralled in a romantic entanglement with an evil incubus in this all-new Isis series adventure. Get your copy of Isis, Dark Incubus in paperback and e-readers today. Now available in paperback and e-readers, Esteem, Horror in the Hamptons. The aspiring angel tries to escape a house of horrors in this action-packed, all-new Esteem series adventure. Get your copy of Esteem, Horror in the Hamptons in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere. Now available in paperback and e-readers, Esteem, Season of the Witch Girl. The aspiring angel takes on a wicked teenage witch in this action-packed, all-new Esteem series adventure. Pick up your copy of Esteem, Season of the Witch Girl in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers today. Support Black-owned and Black-operated digital broadcast media. www.niceradionetwork.com. Nice Radio Network, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.